Welcome to JT Scary Tales. 4 true horror stories animated, tales of fear, darkness, and survival unveils spine-chilling real-life encounters with terrifying strangers, eerie supernatural events, and unimaginable dangers. These horrifying true stories will leave you questioning what's lurking in the shadows and what might happen if you were next. Story 1. The Man in Black. My name is Sanjana, and today, I want to share with you a story that has haunted me for years. It happened when I was only 8 years old, but even now, the memory of that day is so vivid that I can still feel my heart racing whenever I think about it. If my parents hadn't acted so quickly, I'm not sure how things would have turned out. I've never told anyone this in full detail, but now, it's time to let it out. It was a sunny afternoon, and my family had invited some friends over for a small lunch party. I was running around with my friends in the front yard, laughing and playing. My friend's dad was watching over us, making sure everything was all right. My parents were inside, chatting with our guests. It felt like an ordinary day, the kind you don't think twice about. But that sense of calm quickly shattered when a police car pulled up in front of our house. A police officer got out of the car, and his face was stern. He walked up to my friend's dad and asked him in a low voice, "Have you seen a tall man, dressed in all black, walking around the neighborhood?" We were all confused, unsure of what to make of it. My friend's dad, trying to stay calm, responded, "No, we haven't seen anyone." The officer didn't say much after that. He got back in his car and drove off. But something about the whole interaction felt off. The air seemed thicker somehow, heavier. A chill ran down my spine. As soon as the officer left, I felt this unease settle over me, a kind of tension I couldn't shake. "Let's go inside, kids," my dad called to us. We all rushed into the house, and my parents locked the doors. We gathered by the window, trying to get a glimpse of the stranger the police were looking for. I remember staring out, not really sure what I was hoping to see, but feeling the weight of something bad lurking just outside. It wasn't long before we saw him. The man was standing on the other side of the street, peering out from behind some bushes. He was tall, dressed in a black outfit from head to toe, his face hidden under a large, dark hat. It was like he was trying to remain unseen, but somehow, he couldn't hide from us. My dad quietly grabbed his camera and began taking pictures through the window. He sent them to our friends who lived about 5 blocks away, where the police were investigating. They sent the photos to the authorities, and the search for the man began. But I, being a curious 8-year-old, did something I should never have done. I didn't want to just look from inside the house. I needed to see for myself. I stood up and quietly made my way toward the door. I cracked it open, just enough to peek outside. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I saw him move, and something about the way he stood there, in the shadows, made my heart pound. Then, out of nowhere, he started running. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The man was sprinting toward our house, his steps quick and urgent. I felt like my body was glued to the spot. I couldn't move. I didn't know what to do. The only thing I could focus on was the way his hand was moving toward his pocket. My mind raced. Was he pulling out a weapon? A knife? A gun? I stood there, rooted to the ground, too scared to make a sound. My heart was hammering in my chest, and my whole body trembled. I felt like time had slowed down, and all I could do was watch in horror as he came closer. His movements fast, his intentions unclear. But then, just in time, I heard my father shout my name. "Sanjana, get inside now." My dad was at the door in an instant, pulling me inside just as the man reached the steps. My mom quickly slammed the door shut behind me, locking it tight. We all huddled in the living room, listening as the man's footsteps faded away into the distance. The relief I felt was short-lived. We watched from the window, and soon, we saw the police pull up and arrest the man just a few blocks away. They had found him, and it was over. But even though the immediate danger had passed, the fear stayed with me. My mind couldn't shake the image of that man, the way he moved, the way he seemed to be stalking us. Even now, years later, I still wonder what would have happened if my parents hadn't heard me at the door. If they hadn't pulled me back inside at the last second. What if I had been outside just a little longer? What would that man have done to me if I hadn't gotten back in the house in time? I don't know if I'll ever truly know the answer to that. But I do know one thing. That day, I learned what real fear feels like. I learned what it feels like to be watched, to be hunted, to be just a step away from something terrible. And every time I think about that man in black, I can still feel the same cold terror in my chest. To this day, I can't look out a window without wondering, what if he's out there, watching? Story 2. The Blue Room and the Strange Light. My name is Anna, and I've been a fan of these stories for a long time. I've heard so many terrifying experiences, but I've never shared mine. But today, I can't keep it to myself anymore. What happened to me that night has haunted me for years, and I still can't shake the feeling of cold dread that wraps around me every time I think about it. It all started when my family went to visit my grandparents. It was years ago, back when I was in elementary school. My mom, my older sister, and I drove over to my grandparents' house for a weekend visit. I remember it was warm outside, but something in the house felt off, even before the weird things started happening. My grandparents' house was old, full of creaky floors and faded furniture. We had a tradition of staying in the Blue Room, a small bedroom at the top of the stairs. The name was simple. Everything in that room was blue. The curtains, the walls, even the bedspread, it was all the same cold, strange shade of blue. It was almost like being trapped inside a dream. Or worse, a nightmare. That night, my mom and I were sleeping in the Blue Room. My sister stayed downstairs with the rest of the family. I remember falling asleep without a care in the world, as children do, but what happened in the early hours of the morning would change everything. I woke up suddenly, the kind of waking where you don't know where you were at first. It was pitch black, and for some reason, the room felt freezing. It wasn't just the chill in the air. It was something more, a presence. It felt like something was in the room with me. My mom was sleeping beside me, her soft breathing filling the silence. But something wasn't right. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, or maybe my eyes were playing games with me. But no, it was real, just above my mom's head, barely an inch from her face. There was a small light. It wasn't bright like a lamp, but more of a soft, faint glow. It flickered, but not like a candle. It spun around her head, slowly at first, then faster, like it had a mind of its own. I couldn't move, I couldn't even breathe. I just lay there, staring at this light, wondering if I was dreaming. I could feel it drawing me in, pulling me to it, but a strange, primal fear gripped me. Something deep inside me told me not to touch it, not to get any closer. I wanted to scream, but my mouth wouldn't work. My eyes were glued to that light. It seemed to know I was watching it, like it was aware of my fear. Then, just as my mind was starting to unravel, my mom groaned softly in her sleep and slowly opened her eyes. When her gaze fell on the light, her expression shifted instantly. Her eyes widened in panic. She was awake now, fully awake, and the terror in her face was enough to make my blood run cold. "Did you see that?" she whispered to me, her voice barely audible. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. We both watched in horror as the light, which had been spinning so quickly, froze in place, right in front of my mom's face. It was like it was waiting for us to notice it, like it was toying with us. We stared at it for what felt like an eternity, both of us too terrified to move. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished, just disappeared into thin air. My mom jumped out of bed, her heart racing. She turned on the bathroom light and began pacing back and forth. Unable to process what had just happened, I stayed in the bed, frozen, still staring at the spot where the light had been. I couldn't believe it. What was it? Why had it been there? My mind was racing, but it couldn't make sense of anything. "What was that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I don't know," she replied, but her voice was shaky. "Too, but we need to tell the others." When we finally went downstairs to tell my grandparents and the rest of the family, they weren't surprised at all. In fact, they almost seemed used to it. "That room's always been weird," my grandmother said, shaking her head. "Doors slam shut by themselves. Lights turn on and off. And sometimes, there's a feeling in the air, like someone's there, even when you're alone." But what they said next made my stomach drop. "The family who lived here before us, before your grandfather bought the house, had a little boy. He died here, in this room, from a fever. They say he never really left. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up as my grandmother spoke. It was as if the air itself had turned colder, heavier. It wasn't just the house that was haunted. It was the blue room. The room we'd been sleeping in. The room I'd just been trapped in with that terrible, spinning light. That night, my mom and I couldn't sleep. We ended up leaving the lights on in the room, too terrified to even close our eyes. We couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen. What had been in that room? What had been watching us? The next day, my mom shared her side of the story with me. She said that when she first opened her eyes, she thought it was morning. She could feel the light, even through her eyelids, but when she opened them, she saw the small glowing orb right in front of her face. At first, she thought she was dreaming, but when she saw me staring at her, she realized that it was real. I didn't know what to do, she said, shaking her head. I thought I was going crazy. To this day, I can't stop thinking about that light. I've never seen anything like it again. But every time I close my eyes, I feel that cold presence. Sometimes, I wonder what would have happened if I had reached out to touch it. Would it have taken me, like it took the little boy? Would I have been trapped there, with the ghosts of the past? One thing is certain, after that night, I never set foot in the blue room again. And I never will. Story 3. The Terrifying Dream, a Playground of Darkness. It all began about 3 years ago. I was a teenager, just trying to enjoy the simple moments of life, when something twisted and terrifying started to unfold in my dreams. At first, it seemed like any ordinary dream, but then it turned into something far darker, something I couldn't escape. Every night, it would return, and it grew more vivid, more intense, and more haunting with each passing night. In the dream, I was always on the same swing at an old, eerie playground. The place looked familiar, but at the same time, something about it was wrong. The swings creaked in the wind. The ground was covered in cracked asphalt. And the sky was always an unsettling shade of dark crimson. Like the sun had died and left the world in a constant state of twilight. I was never alone in these dreams. There was always a man standing beside me. His features were always blurry, indistinct, but I could tell he was tall, thin, and dressed entirely in black. His presence alone sent chills down my spine, and I could never shake the feeling that something about him was deeply, horribly wrong. He spoke in a strange language, one that I couldn't understand, but oddly enough, I understood him. It was as if his words, even in that alien tongue, had an unsettling clarity in my mind. His name, he told me, was H. That was the first thing he ever said to me. It was a name that meant nothing to me, but in the dream, it carried weight, as if it was a warning. The first few times I had this dream, it wasn't too frightening. I would wake up, confused, my heart pounding, but nothing more. But soon, the dream began to change. One night, after we exchanged our usual wordless greetings, the sunset faded quickly. The darkness swallowed the playground, and what was once a faint glow from the dying light turned into pure blackness. I couldn't see anything, not the swings, not the man standing beside me, not even the ground beneath my feet. It was like a deep, suffocating void, the kind of darkness that presses in on you from all sides and makes you feel like you're drowning in it. Then came the smell. It was unbearable, a sickly, rotten stench that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It filled my lungs, and I gagged, trying to breathe, but it was all I could smell. My skin prickled with fear as the air around me seemed to hum with a strange energy. And then I heard it. Low growling noises, distant at first, but growing louder. The sound was unnatural, like something that shouldn't exist, and it sent a shiver down my spine. These growls weren't the sound of animals, not the kind of things you'd hear in the wild. They were deep, unnatural, like 1,000 beasts were circling, waiting to pounce. I turned to H, but he was gone. In his place, I could see the faint outline of something far worse. They were coming, creatures that glowed with a malevolent red light. Their eyes were like burning embers, and their movements were quick, almost too fast for my eyes to follow. They were the predators, the things that lurked in the darkness, and I could feel them getting closer, closer with every growl, with every shuffling step. Then, the voice of H rang out. loud and desperate. "Wake up," he screamed. His voice was a sharp command, but the terror in it made my heart race. His words felt like they were tearing through the suffocating dark. And the last thing I remember before I woke up was the panic in his voice. I jolted awake in my bed, gasping for breath, my body drenched in sweat. It was always the same, always that sense of terror. That feeling of being hunted. That eerie presence of the creatures coming for me. It felt real. It felt like it had been more than just a dream. I looked at the clock. 4:30 a.m. I was always waking up at that exact time. As if the nightmare had a set schedule. I couldn't explain it. I didn't know what it meant. What was the playground? Who were those creatures? And who, or what, was H? I tried searching online, asking people if they had any idea what it could mean. But no one seemed to know. Every night, the dream returned, and the more I tried to understand it, the more it twisted and turned, slipping away from my grasp like a shadow. And then, one night, it happened again. The dream, the same playground, the same man standing beside me. But this time, something was different. This time, H looked at me with a frown, something darker in his eyes. "Do you know where this is?" he asked in that strange language. His voice no longer comforting. "Please, don't come here," he begged. "This is where the soul predators exist." My heart froze at the mention of soul predators. What did that mean? I wanted to ask, but he didn't give me the chance. H looked up at the sky, his face filled with fear. And then he ran. The darkness came faster this time. It wasn't just a void, it was like the night itself was alive. Pressing in from all sides, suffocating me. The creatures, the predators, were closer now. Their footsteps echoing around me. Thousands of feet moving in perfect unison. Growing louder and louder with every passing second. I could feel them closing in on me. Their eyes glowing like coals in the dark. I couldn't move, couldn't escape. I tried to wake up, but I couldn't. The fear was too strong. I felt like I was being crushed by the weight of it. My body frozen in place as those creatures surrounded me. And then, just as I thought I would lose my mind, I heard them, their whispers. The language they spoke was foreign, filled with sounds I couldn't even begin to comprehend. But I understood their intent. I was next. I could hear them coming closer. Their bodies rustling like leaves in the wind. Their hot breath filled my ears. And then, one of them reached out and grabbed me. The pain was excruciating. Its teeth sank into my arm, sharp as knives, tearing into my flesh. I couldn't scream. I tried to move, to wake up, but the pain was so real, so visceral. Finally, I opened my eyes, back in my bed, heart pounding, the dream still fresh in my mind. But this time, it wasn't over. I looked at my arm and found it swollen, inflamed. The doctor confirmed it. The wound had become infected. And I was lucky I hadn't waited any longer. But what terrified me more than the infection was the fact that the dream didn't stop. Every night, the playground calls me back. And every night, I wake up just before the predators get me. But now, there's something worse. Every time I wake up, I feel the pull. I feel the joy of being in that playground. Like I belong there. I no longer want to wake up. And every time I return, the question haunts me. What would happen if I let them catch me? What would happen if I let them eat me? Story 4. The Break-In. A terrifying night. It was an ordinary Friday evening in the small village where my family and I lived. Everything felt normal, quiet, peaceful, and safe. My mom was watching TV in the living room. My grandmother was on the phone in the kitchen. And I was sitting on my iPad, lost in my own world. It was just another evening like any other. But little did I know. That night, our lives would be turned upside down in a way I would never forget. Our house was right across from a police station. And everything was so close-knit in our village that we never thought anything could go wrong. Our neighbors were friendly, the streets were calm, and the shop just 3 doors down from our house made us feel like we were all one big family. Nothing ever felt out of place until that night. It all started with a noise. At first, I thought I had imagined it. But then, my mom jumped out of her seat, her eyes fixed on the window. Something had caught her attention. I glanced up at her, confused. Her face went pale as she stood frozen, staring outside. "Do you see that?" she whispered, her voice tense. I shrugged it off at first. But then I noticed it too. Two men were running up the street, shouting and stumbling, clearly drunk. One was in his 40s, dressed in all black, and the other was a younger man in his 30s, wearing a light gray tracksuit. The older man seemed more composed, trying to calm the younger one, who was clearly agitated. Then, just as quickly as it had started, everything seemed to settle. My mom sat back down, but her eyes never left the window. There was something in her gaze, a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. I tried to return to my iPad, but my stomach twisted with an uncomfortable feeling I couldn't explain. Then, the thud came. It was loud, sudden, and it shook the whole house. My mom's face drained of color as she jumped up again, rushing to the hallway. I followed her, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was slamming themselves against our front door. My grandmother, hearing the commotion, joined us in the hallway. Together, we all rushed to the door, pressing our weight against it as the man in the gray tracksuit continued to batter it, his drunken shouts echoing through the house. "Get out of the damn house," he screamed, his voice filled with rage. "I'll break in if I have to." I froze in terror, my whole body shaking. The man's pounding on the door grew louder, each bang more forceful than the last. I could hear his desperate breathing, his anger spilling out into the night air. I was terrified. This wasn't a random drunk. There was something about him that felt dangerous, something that didn't belong in our neighborhood. Mom was on the phone with the police, trying to keep calm. The operator reassured her that they were on their way, but it felt like hours before we heard any sirens. By that time, we were all paralyzed with fear, trapped behind our front door, waiting for something to happen. Then, as if the night couldn't get worse, I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. I dared to peek through the small window upstairs, my hands trembling. The black BMW that had been parked a few doors down earlier had just driven up in front of our house. The two men got out. They were both holding bottles of vodka, swaying in the streetlight. The older man in black was the first to approach the shop next to our house. I watched through the window, my heart pounding in my chest. He walked into the shop, grabbed something, and quickly returned to the car. What were they doing? Why did they look so desperate? We were paralyzed in fear. The door was locked, but would it be enough? Would they break it down? My mind raced with a million worst-case scenarios. My mom has a brain tumor. If they forced their way in and pushed her, she could fall, and it could be fatal. My grandmother had just had knee surgery, and I couldn't bear to think of what would happen to her if they got inside. I felt my stomach turn as I thought about the possibility of them hurting us, of them getting inside where we were trapped. I couldn't help but think of one more thing. Earlier that morning, I had tripped and scraped my knees on the sidewalk. If I hadn't fallen and stayed home, I would have gone to the shop and probably crossed paths with those two men on the way back. It hit me like a ton of bricks. If I had been there, I might have walked straight into the nightmare unfolding right outside our front door. But somehow, we were lucky. The men didn't try to force their way in. Instead, after what felt like an eternity, they turned around, got into their car, and drove off. The tension in the air was unbearable as we watched them disappear into the night. But the terror didn't stop there. My mom quickly ran upstairs to check for them, looking out the small bathroom window. I followed her, my feet moving on their own as I stared at the car. It was parked just outside, like it was waiting for something. My grandmother and I stayed close to the door, our hands shaking as we tried to process what had just happened. We watched as the men in the BMW drove away, making a U-turn and parking right outside our house again. The older man got out, walked back to the shop, and grabbed something else before returning to the car. But the police never came. The situation had been that close. My mom didn't know what to do. We all stayed inside, huddled together in silence, unsure of whether it was over. When the police finally arrived, the two men were long gone. They said there was nothing they could do unless the men had actually broken into our house. To this day, I can't shake the terror of that night. I keep thinking about what might have happened if my mom hadn't been able to call the police. Or if they had managed to break through the door. What if I had been in the wrong place at the wrong time? What if my grandmother had gotten hurt? That night, we were lucky. We got to stay safe. But I'll never forget the fear that gripped me as I realized how close we came to something truly horrible. What haunts me the most is not just the fear, but the realization that things could have gone so much worse. The thought of what could have happened if we hadn't acted fast, it still lingers. Even now, that was the night I learned how quickly things can spiral out of control. And how easily the people you trust can be threatened by the darkness that hides just outside your door. The end. Thanks for watching. Do you love spine-chilling stories and eerie mysteries? You've come to the right place. At JT Scary Tales, we bring you the most terrifying and thrilling scary tales from around the world. From haunted places to unexplained phenomena, our scary tales will keep you on the edge of your seat. Subscribe now and dive into the dark world of scary tales.